Hello, I'm Michael for GameWatcher.com, and today we're going to be talking about Northgard and giving our first impressions of the new strategy game based on Norse mythology in development on early access by Shiro Games. In Northgard, you play the role of a Viking clan who has recently discovered a new land filled with mystery and danger, which is of course Northgard. So the boldest of clans have set sail and are set to conquer the new lands and explore their mysteries and treasures. And it's a case of very similar to games like Age of Empires, with a little bit of kind of civilization inspiration thrown in there. You must take your village, build your village up, and then conquer the various territories in Northgard, fighting off enemies, fighting off monsters, and securing your place in immortality. Now, the game is of course in early access, and everything that you do see here is subject to change, and while the core mechanics of the game are in place, the game is not yet feature complete, with things like the fully story driven campaign is not in, a full multiplayer mode is not in, and of course things like full-blown diplomacy options and various in-game options are not yet in play in this game. The way the game is structured is into territory conquest, and is all about taking new territory over so that you can expand your village and get more resources. Now, it's a blend between a traditional strategy, so you've got things like resource management in there, you've got base building, you have unit production, and of course you have to manage everything in between those. And what the great thing about Northgard at the moment is that it's set up in a way that you have to be very strategic in how you build your base, because the zones themselves only allow for a certain number of buildings to be built. So after you capture a zone, which will cost you the food resource, you are able to then build upon that zone. And some zones will allow you to build 3 buildings, some will allow you to build 2 buildings. And you have to be careful in what you actually want to build on that, because some resources, for example stone or iron, will only be available in certain territories. So you have to make sure that you use that territory that that resource is in. You have to use it wisely. So you're going to have to know that when you take over that territory that has a stone deposit, you're going to have to build a quarry. And it's a case of making sure that you build smartly so that you don't build and waste resources, because resources are fairly hard to come by. Now, one of the reasons that resources are fairly hard to come by is the fact that the game has a seasonal cycle and a weather cycle. So in the summertime and the springtime, your Vikings will be able to gather resources at much higher rates. They will be able to gather food resources at much higher rates. But when the winter comes, that production is lowered and sometimes goes into the negative. So it's important to make sure that you've collected enough resources for your villagers to survive the winter. As your territory expands and your village grows, you will also have to improve your technology. Now, this is done by collecting the resource known as lore, and not only do you gain lore from normal gameplay, but you can actually create lore masters in various buildings that will generate lore for you. You can then spend lore in the technology tree and purchase something like sharp weapons, which will increase not only your warriors' fighting prowess, but of course the weapons for things like hunters or woodcutters. The way the building and village system works is that every villager that gets created from the town hall after a certain period of time will just be a normal villager, and if you leave them alone, they will just go and start to gather food and forage food from the forests. However, to be able to make them do something like become a woodcutter, become a miner, or even train them to become one of your warriors, you must assign them to a building, and then they will become that job. Now, it's important to note that things like mine workers don't last forever, because ultimately the deposits will run out, which means that you will have to constantly manage, and it's not too overbearing, but you will have to constantly manage your villagers to make sure that there's none of them standing around doing nothing. The further you expand, the more threats and enemies that you will encounter. So not only are you playing against the AI factions, who are also Vikings, who will try and attack and take over your territory, but you also have to compile and fight against things like Norse mythology monsters. So you're facing against Draugrs, you're facing against dead Valkyries, you're facing against Jotuns, big giants, and all kinds of wonderful, fantastic, mystical beings that will absolutely tear your warriors to shreds. And it's one of those things that the combat is not particularly in depth. There's nothing too complex about it. It's very simple. You build some warriors and then you just send them to the territory that you want to fight. So if there are a set of wolves in the next territory that you would like to conquer, you must first send in your warriors to deal with every single enemy in that territory before you're able to colonize it. Even in its early access state, the game does have a nice progression system about it. So not only are you upgrading your technology via the lore tree and upgrading things so that you get more buffs and more production, that kind of thing, but you can also upgrade your units individually, so you can give your warriors better weapons and armor. And then on top of that, you also can improve your buildings, which will give you access to newer buildings on top of that. So there's a nice sense of progression throughout the game, and overall, thus far, it certainly feels polished, even though it's not feature complete. For me, overall, even at this early access stage, it is a nice overall indie strategy game. It has some great progression in there. The visuals and art style, they look really nice and they're a lot of fun. The soundtrack is a lot of fun and it's really nice and it works well with the overall aesthetic of the game. The core gameplay mechanics that are in there at the moment work and are executed very well. It provides a very much enjoyable experience. It's something that I would like to play again and again, and I think that it can only get better over the course of its development cycle. As newer things put in, as more features come in, things like full-blown diplomacy options, like a fully story-driven campaign mode, like a multiplayer mode, like new enemies, interesting items to find on the world map itself, and maybe a little bit of personalized character progression for your units. Some things like that would be really nice, and I think that with the current state of the version it's in at the moment, it's certainly something to keep an eye on. If you are absolutely in love with indie strategy games, then it's worth picking up probably and getting your opinion in on the early access development. But other than that, it certainly looks like it is going to be a hit when it comes out of early access, barring that nothing goes terribly wrong. And so that is our first impressions of Northgard. Thanks for watching. Head on over to GameWatcher.com for more.